part one of the SS Normandy documentary. Part two is available to watch next. Part two will appear at the end of the video.
Why do we build beautiful things in troubled times? France in 1931 was a nation searching for reassurance. The financial collapse that had begun in America 2 years earlier was now spreading across Europe like a slow tide. Banks were failing. Factories were closing their gates. Men who had worked all their lives found themselves standing in queues for bread. Yet in this moment of contraction, France decided to build the largest, fastest, most beautiful passenger ship the world had ever seen. This decision was not made in defiance of the economic crisis. It was made because of it. When a nation feels itself slipping, it reaches for symbols. It builds monuments that say, we are still capable of greatness. We still possess mastery. We have not lost our way. The French line, Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, had been crossing the Atlantic since 1864. For nearly 70 years, their ships had carried mail, cargo, immigrants, and the wealthy between Le Havre and New York. But by 1930, the company faced a profound challenge. German ships were faster. British ships were larger. American ships were more modern. France needed to respond. The decision to build what would become SS Normandie was announced in July 1929, 3 months before the Wall Street crash. Construction would not begin for another 2 years. In that interval, the world changed. What had been conceived as a commercial venture became something else entirely, a statement of national identity during a time of international anxiety. We must understand what the transatlantic passenger trade meant in this era. These were not cruise ships. They were not floating resorts. They were working vessels that formed the primary link between Europe and America. Before reliable transatlantic flight, if you needed to cross the ocean, you took a ship. There was no alternative. The fastest crossing time in 1930 was approximately 5 days. Businessmen, diplomats, artists, scientists all spent nearly a week at sea simply to conduct their affairs on the other continent. The ship was not leisure, it was infrastructure. But it was also theater. The great ocean liners of the late 1920s were stages upon which nations performed their cultural values. Germany built ships that emphasized engineering precision and mechanical efficiency. Britain built ships that replicated the aristocratic country house at sea, with oak paneling and servants in livery. America built ships that celebrated modernity and democratic comfort. What would France build? The French approach to this question revealed something essential about how the nation saw itself. France would not compete on speed alone, though speed mattered. France would not compete on size alone, though size mattered. France would compete on beauty. This was not vanity, it was strategy. French culture in the 1930s still held enormous prestige. Paris was the center of the art world. French fashion dictated taste across Europe and America. French cuisine was the standard against which all other cooking was measured. French wine, French perfume, French luxury goods commanded premium prices. The ship would be an extension of this cultural authority. But there was another dimension to the project. France had lost nearly 1.5 million men in the Great War. That was one of every 28 citizens dead. An entire generation had been devastated. The survivors carried physical and psychological wounds that would never fully heal. The war had been over for 13 years when construction began, but the trauma remained. When a society suffers loss on this scale, it seeks ways to prove to itself that creation is still possible, that beauty can still be made, that the future might hold something other than destruction. SS Normandie was built in the shadow of the Somme. We must also consider the geopolitical context. By 1931, everyone understood that another war was possible. Hitler's National Socialist Party had gained significant support in Germany. Mussolini had been in power in Italy for 9 years. Soviet Russia was pursuing forced industrialization at enormous human cost. The old order established after Versailles was showing cracks. In this climate, building the world's most magnificent ship was both optimistic and melancholic. It was an act of hope that occurred with the knowledge that hope might not be enough. The initial design parameters were clear. The ship must be capable of crossing the Atlantic in less than 5 days. It must be larger than any existing passenger vessel. It must demonstrate technical innovation. And it must be unmistakably, undeniably French. These requirements were not contradictory, but they were in tension. Speed required power and streamlining. Size required stability and passenger capacity. Technical innovation required untested solutions. French identity required artistic coherence. The team assembled to solve these problems would include naval architects, marine engineers, artists, designers, craftsmen, and industrial specialists. More than 40 design firms would contribute. The result would be not a ship designed by committee, but a ship designed by a culture. This is the story of that design, that construction, that brief triumph, and that final tragedy. It begins not with steel or engines, but with an idea that a nation might express its highest values through a vessel built to carry people across an ocean. That functionality and beauty need not be separate, that even in darkness, we continue to create light. The ship was given a name before her keel was laid. She would be called Normandie, after the northern province that had given France some of its most productive farmland, its most determined soldiers, and its most independent spirit. The name was perfect. Normandy was traditional but not backward. It was French to its core but had ancient connections to Britain. It was agricultural but also coastal, facing outward toward the Atlantic and the wider world. Everything that followed would attempt to live up to that name. Vladimir Yorkovich was Russian. This fact mattered. When France decided to build its supreme maritime achievement, the man who would solve its most critical technical problem was not French. He was an exile, a refugee from the Bolshevik Revolution, a former officer in the Imperial Russian Navy who had fled to Paris in 1920 with nothing. Yorkovich understood hydrodynamics. More specifically, he understood that every ship then crossing the Atlantic was fighting the water rather than moving through it. The standard ship design of the era used a sharp bow to cut through waves. This seemed logical, but it was wrong. Yorkovich proposed the opposite, a bulbous bow that would slip beneath the surface, creating an underwater wave that would partially cancel the wave created by the ship's passage. This would reduce resistance, it would increase speed, it would reduce fuel consumption. The French line engineers were skeptical. They consulted their own experts. They ran calculations. Eventually, they agreed to test Yorkovich's design in a towing tank. The results were undeniable. His hull form was significantly more efficient than conventional designs. This decision to hire an immigrant engineer with an unconventional idea tells us something important about the Normandie project. It was not insular. It was not nationalistic in a narrow sense. The ship would be French, but it would be French through excellence, not through exclusion. The chief naval architect was Paul Lebris, a Frenchman who had spent his entire career designing ships. Lebris understood that Yorkovich's hull was revolutionary, but a hull is not a ship. Above the waterline, everything remained to be designed: superstructure, passenger accommodations, cargo holds, mechanical systems, safety features. Lebris worked methodically. He began with the fundamental equation of ocean liner design: passenger capacity against speed against fuel efficiency. Every choice cascaded into other choices. Adding passenger cabins increased weight, which reduced speed, which required more power, which required more fuel, which added more weight. The ship would measure 293 meters in length overall. This was slightly longer than any existing vessel, but length alone meant little. What mattered was displacement, the amount of water the ship pushed aside. Normandie would displace nearly 80,000 tons when fully loaded. To move this mass at the required speed demanded engines of unprecedented power. The engineering firm of Penharet would design 4 turboelectric propulsion units generating 160,000 horsepower. This was more power than many entire cities consumed. But power created problems: heat, vibration, noise, weight, complexity. Each engineering solution created new engineering challenges. Consider the propellers. Normandie would have 4 propellers, each weighing approximately 23 tons. They needed to be large enough to transfer the engine's power to the water without cavitation, the formation of destructive bubbles that would erode the bronze. They needed to be precisely balanced to avoid vibration. They needed to be positioned to avoid interfering with each other's water flow. The solution involved extensive model testing. Scale models of the hull and propeller arrangement were tested in facilities in Paris and Hamburg. Engineers adjusted angles, spacing, and blade design based on thousands of test runs. This testing was expensive, it was time-consuming, it delayed construction, but it was essential. There would be no opportunity to redesign the propellers after the ship was built. While engineers solved mechanical problems, another group was addressing aesthetic ones. The interior designer Henry Packen was given an extraordinary brief: create public spaces that would be the finest examples of French decorative arts, but do so within the structural constraints of a ship. Rooms could not be any size or shape. They had to fit between steel bulkheads, around ventilation shafts, above and below other decks, within weight limits. Packen assembled a team that included some of the most important artists working in France. Jean Dupers would create murals, René Lalique would design lighting, Jean Dunand would create lacquer panels, Raymond Subs would design metalwork. This was not decoration applied to a ship, it was art integrated into architecture. The challenge was coherence. 40 different designers creating elements for different spaces could easily produce chaos. Packen's role was to establish principles that would unify the work while allowing individual expression. He chose Art Moderne, what would later be called Art Deco, as the governing aesthetic. This style emphasized geometric forms, rich materials, expert craftsmanship, and a specific kind of luxury that was modern but not stark, decorative but not fussy. Every public room on the ship would express these principles. The first-class dining room would be the largest room ever installed on a ship, measuring 93 meters long and running the full width of the vessel. It would seat 700 passengers. It would rise through 3 decks, with a ceiling height of 8 meters. Think about this engineering challenge. A room that large, that tall, on a structure that must remain flexible enough to handle ocean waves. The steel frame had to support the ceiling without visible columns. The floor had to accommodate expansion joints that would allow the hull to flex without cracking the elaborate parquet. Below decks, engineers were designing systems that would be invisible to passengers but essential to their comfort. Normandie would be fully air-conditioned, one of the first ships to achieve this. Air would be drawn in, filtered, heated or cooled, humidified or dehumidified, then distributed through kilometers of ductwork to every cabin and public space. The air conditioning plant alone weighed hundreds of tons. It required enormous refrigeration units, extensive electrical systems, and careful design to ensure that ductwork did not create noise or vibration that passengers could detect. The ship would carry enough fresh water for 5,000 people to shower, bathe, wash, and drink for a week without rationing. This required distillation plants that could produce 400 tons of fresh water per day from seawater. The distillation process required heat, which meant coordinating with the engine room systems. Electricity was equally complex. Normandie would generate enough electrical power for a city of 200,000 people. This required multiple generator rooms, redundant systems, extensive wiring, and sophisticated switchboards to manage distribution. Every system had to be designed with redundancy. If one generator failed, others must carry the load. If one boiler failed, others must maintain power. If one water pump failed, others must maintain pressure. A passenger ship cannot pull over to the side of the road when something breaks. Fire was the constant nightmare. A ship is a closed environment surrounded by water but filled with flammable materials: wood, fabric, paper, fuel, oil. Fire at sea, far from any help, could be catastrophic. Normandie would have the most sophisticated fire detection and suppression system yet installed on a ship. Steel fire doors could be closed to divide the ship into zones. Fire main pumps could deliver high-pressure water to any point. Sprinkler systems would activate automatically in cargo holds. Each crew member would be trained in firefighting procedures. These systems were unglamorous. No passenger would ever see them under normal circumstances, but they represented thousands of hours of engineering work and significant expense. The design phase lasted 3 years. From 1929 to 1932, hundreds of people worked on drawings, calculations, models, and specifications. This work happened in offices in Paris, in drafting rooms in Saint-Nazaire, in testing facilities in Hamburg, in workshops scattered across France. When construction finally began, the design was not finished. It continued throughout the building process, with modifications and refinements as theoretical plans encountered practical reality, but the essential character of the ship had been established: its form, its purpose, its identity. SS Normandie would be fast, large, powerful, and beautiful. It would be technically advanced, but traditionally crafted. It would be modern in its engineering and classical in its art. It would be uncompromisingly French while incorporating ideas from across Europe. This combination of qualities, this particular balance of competing values, made the ship unique. It was not simply the best of its type, it was its own type. The design collective had succeeded. Now the workers had to build what the designers had imagined. Water does not yield easily. When a ship moves through water, it must push aside its own weight in water every second. This requires enormous force. Most of that force is wasted in creating turbulence, waves, and resistance that slow the vessel. Yorkovich's bulbous bow addressed this waste directly. By moving the bow wave underwater and forward along the hull, the design reduced the high-pressure zone that formed ahead of conventional ships. Less pressure meant less resistance. Less resistance meant higher speed or lower fuel consumption at the same speed. But theory and practice are different things. Model tests were promising, but models operate at different Reynolds numbers than full-scale ships. The viscosity effects, the turbulence patterns, the wave interactions all scale imperfectly. What worked at model scale might fail at full scale. The French line was betting the future of the company on this uncertainty. Let us understand the stakes. If Yorkovich's hull performed as predicted, Normandie would be the fastest ship on the Atlantic, capable of capturing the blue ribbon, the symbolic prize for the fastest crossing. This would generate publicity, prestige, and passenger bookings. If the hull underperformed, if the bulbous bow created unexpected problems, if the ship could not reach its design speed, the entire project would be compromised. The company would have built the largest, most expensive ship in the world, and it would be a failure. There was no way to test this except to build the ship and sail it. The hull form itself was unprecedented. Viewed from the front, Normandie's bow was broad and almost flat, completely different from the knife-like bows of contemporary ships. Viewed from the side, the bow protruded forward in a bulge that extended below the waterline. The hull then curved inward before widening again to the ship's maximum beam. This shape created hydrodynamic effects that were complex and interdependent. The bulbous bow generated its own wave system. The curved sections along the hull managed water flow to minimize turbulence. The stern taper was designed to allow clean separation of water flow and reduce wake turbulence. Every curve, every angle, every transition had been calculated to reduce resistance. But water is not a theoretical fluid. It is real, viscous, and unpredictable. The propeller arrangement was equally critical. 4 propellers meant that each propeller operated in disturbed water from the others. The engineers positioned the inboard propellers higher and slightly forward of the outboard propellers. This arrangement reduced interference, but it created asymmetric thrust vectors that had to be compensated for in the steering system. The rudder was massive. A single piece of fabricated steel standing over 10 meters tall and weighing more than 200 tons. Its size was necessary to provide adequate steering authority for a ship of Normandie's length and speed, but a large rudder creates drag even when centered. The engineers shaped it to minimize resistance while maintaining effectiveness. Think about what happens when a ship this large turns. The stern begins to swing outward while the bow rotates inward. The entire hull is moving sideways through the water as well as forward. This creates enormous lateral forces on the hull plating, the frames, and the rudder itself. Everything must be strong enough to withstand these forces without yielding or cracking. The structural engineering was inseparable from the hydrodynamic engineering. The hull shape determined the water flow. The water flow determined the forces. The forces determined the structural requirements. The structural requirements determined the weight. The weight affected the displacement and therefore the water flow. Everything connected to everything else. French engineers were conservative by training and experience. They tended to prefer proven solutions and adequate safety margins. Yukovic was asking them to trust calculations and model tests rather than experience. This created institutional tension throughout the design process. The compromise was extensive testing. Before the keel was laid, more than 200 hull configurations were tested in model form. Each test measured resistance at different speeds, in different water conditions, with different propeller arrangements. The data was analyzed, the designs were refined, and the tests were repeated. This iterative process was expensive and time-consuming, but it was also reassuring. By the time construction began, the engineers had confidence that the hull form would perform. They had data. They had seen the results. They were not simply hopping. Still, doubt remained. Models are models, ships are ships. The transition between the bulbous bow and the main hull was particularly challenging. This area experienced complex flow patterns as water moved from the forward portion of the bulb along the curves toward the midship section. If the curve was too sharp, flow would separate and create turbulence. If the curve was too gradual, the bulb would not be effective. The final design represented a balance that could only be validated at full scale. The first time Normandie sailed at speed, the engineers would discover whether years of work had produced success or failure. We should understand what at speed meant for this ship. Normandie was designed to sustain 29 knots, approximately 54 kilometers per hour, for days at a time. This speed required burning approximately 1,000 tons of fuel oil per day. The engines would generate enough heat to warm a small city. The propellers would be turning at sufficient speed that the blade tips were moving through the water at over 70 kilometers per hour. At these speeds, even small imperfections in the hull surface could create significant problems. A dent, a misaligned plate, a protruding rivet could create turbulence that would increase resistance. The hull had to be smooth not just to the eye, but to the water. French shipbuilders understood this. The hull plating was installed with care, each plate carefully fed to match the curves, each rivet countersunk so that no protrusion disrupted the flow. After construction, before painting, divers inspected the underwater hull section by section, marking any irregularities for correction. The paint itself was chosen for hydrodynamic properties. Multiple coats were applied to create a smooth surface. The paint had to be hard enough to resist abrasion from sand and debris in the water, but smooth enough not to create resistance. These details seem minor. They were not. At 29 knots, Normandie was covering nearly 50 meters every second. Over a 5-day crossing, small inefficiencies in the hull surface could waste tons of fuel or cost hours of time. Hydrodynamic efficiency was also an economic issue. Fuel oil was expensive. Every ton burned was a cost that had to be recovered through passenger fares. If Normandie could cross the Atlantic using less fuel than her British and German competitors, the French line could either charge lower fares or enjoy higher profit margins. This economic dimension affected every design decision. Engineers were not simply trying to build the fastest ship. They were trying to build the most efficient fast ship. Speed at any cost would be simple. Speed at acceptable cost was the challenge. The solution was not a single innovation, but an integrated system. The hull form reduced resistance. The propellers efficiently converted power to thrust. The engines generated that power with minimal waste. The ship's weight was controlled to avoid unnecessary displacement. Each element supported the others. When we look at photographs of Normandie, we see elegance and grace. These qualities were not aesthetic choices applied to a functional object. They were the visible expression of hydrodynamic efficiency. The ship looked fast because it was designed to be fast. Form followed function, but function produced beauty. This unity of engineering and aesthetic was distinctly French. German ships of the era looked powerful and mechanical. British ships looked comfortable and traditional. American ships looked modern and functional. Normandie looked like it was moving even when standing still. This was the hydrodynamic revolution, not simply making ships faster, but understanding that speed required rethinking every assumption about hull form, propulsion, and the relationship between a vessel and the water it moved through. The revolution was not complete. Engineers would continue refining hull forms for decades, but Normandie represented a fundamental advance, a moment when theory and practice aligned to produce something genuinely new. Whether that newness would be vindicated remained to be seen. The ship still had to be built. The theories still had to face the Atlantic. The shipyard at Saint-Nazaire had been building ships since the mid-19th century. It was located on the Loire estuary, where the river widened toward the Atlantic. The site offered deep water, protection from ocean storms, and rail connections to the industrial regions of France. By 1931, the yard employed approximately 9,000 workers. It had multiple building ways, extensive machine shops, steel fabrication facilities, and specialized workshops for everything from carpentry to electrical work. The decision to build Normandie at Saint-Nazaire was logical but not inevitable. Other French yards might have competed for the contract. Saint-Nazaire won because it had the capacity, the experience, and the skilled workforce necessary for a project of this scale. The keel was laid on January 26, 1931. This ceremony marked the official beginning of construction, though preparatory work had been underway for months. Steel had been ordered, drawings had been completed, machinery had been manufactured. The keel itself was not a single piece. It was an assembly of steel plates and structural members that formed the backbone of the ship. This assembly rested on wooden blocks arranged on the building way, a long sloped platform that led down to the water. Around this keel, the ship would grow upward and outward. Workers would add frames, plates, decks, bulkheads, and superstructure until the basic hull was complete. Then the ship would be launched, still incomplete, and towed to a fitting-out berth where all the interior work would be done. This process would take more than 4 years. For perspective, that is longer than France's entire involvement in World War I. Building Normandie was a sustained industrial effort comparable to military production. The workforce was hierarchical. At the top were naval architects and engineers who interpreted drawings and specified methods. Below them were foremen who supervised work crews. Below them were skilled tradesmen, riveters, welders, platers, fitters, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, painters. And below them were labkers who moved materials, cleaned work areas, and performed unskilled tasks. A typical day at the yard began before dawn. Workers arrived by train, by bicycle, on foot. They changed into work clothes, collected their tools, and made their way to their assigned locations on the ship. Some worked inside the hull in dark, confined spaces. Others worked high on staging, exposed to weather. Still others worked in shops, fabricating components that would later be installed. The work was dangerous. Shipbuilding involves heavy materials, powerful machinery, working at height, working in confined spaces. Hot work with torches and rivet forges. Men were injured regularly, some were killed. This was accepted as the price of industrial work in that era. The scale of Normandie created specific challenges. The hull was so large that workers on one end could not see workers on the other end. Communication was difficult. Coordinating work required careful planning and rigid schedules. If one crew fell behind, it could delay crews whose work depended on the first crew's completion. Steel arrived at the yard in plates and structural shapes. These had to be cut to size, bent to shape, and assembled according to drawings. The hull curves were complex, requiring skilled workers to heat and bend steel plates to match templates. This was hot, strenuous work done with hand tools and brute force. Riveting held the steel together. Teams of riveters worked in rhythm, one man heating rivets in a forge, another catching the hot rivet in a bucket and quickly placing it in a hole, a third using a pneumatic hammer to mushroom the rivet and create a tight joint. The noise was extraordinary. Men who worked as riveters for years often lost their hearing. Welding was beginning to replace riveting for some applications in the early 1930s. Electric arc welding could create strong joints with less weight and less lubk than riveting, but welding required skill and was not yet fully trusted for critical structural work. Normandie used both methods, with welding for secondary structures and riveting for primary load-bearing joints. As the hull grew, the building way became a vertical city. Wooden scaffolding surrounded the ship on all sides, allowing workers to access every part of the structure. This scaffolding had to be strong enough to support workers, materials, and equipment, yet flexible enough to be reconfigured as the ship took shape. Think about the logistics. Every steel plate, every frame, every piece of equipment had to be lifted into position. Some pieces weighed tons. The yard had cranes, but crane capacity was limited. Heavy components had to be lifted carefully, positioned precisely, and secured properly. A dropped load could kill workers below and damage completed work. The construction proceeded from the keel upward and from the center outward. The strongest portions of the hull were built first, creating a stable foundation for subsequent work. Decks were added level by level. Bulkheads subdivided the interior into watertight compartments. Machinery spaces were framed to accommodate the enormous engines and boilers. By late 1932, the basic hull was recognizable as a ship. The bow emerged forward, the stern rose aft, the superstructure began to take shape. Visitors to the yard could stand at a distance and see Normandie's distinctive silhouette. But most of the work remained invisible. Inside the hull, workers were installing miles of piping for water, steam, fuel oil, and compressed air. They were running cables for electrical power, lighting, and communication. They were building foundations for machinery. They were creating voids for cargo holds and tanks. This interior work was claustrophobic and disorienting. The hull was a maze of steel compartments connected by narrow passageways and vertical ladders. Workers navigated by memory and by following painted symbols on bulkheads. Getting lost inside an unfinished ship was a real possibility. Ventilation was poor. In summer, interior spaces became unbearably hot. In winter, they were cold and damp. Workers burned oil lamps and later electric lights, but illumination was always inadequate. Much of the work was done by feel as much as by sight. The engine room spaces were vast. Normandie's propulsion plant was taller than a four-story building and extended more than 50 meters along the hull. Creating spaces large enough to accommodate this machinery required careful structural engineering. Steel girders crisscrossed the engine room, supporting decks above while leaving room for machinery below. Installing the engines and boilers could not begin until the hull was launched. These components were too heavy to be lifted into the ship while it rested on the building way. They would be installed later, after the hull was afloat and accessible from the water. The launch was scheduled for October 29, 1932. This date carried symbolic weight. It was nearly 1 year after the keel laying, but the ship was far from complete. Launching would mark a transition from one phase of construction to another. Before launch, the hull had to be prepared. The wooden blocks supporting the keel were replaced with a launching cradle, a specially designed structure that would slide down the building way when released, carrying the ship into the water. This cradle was built around the hull and had to be precisely aligned with the building way. The launching process was controlled but not without risk. Once released, the cradle would accelerate down the way under gravity and the ship's weight. The hull would enter the water's stern first, creating an enormous splash and wave. If anything went wrong, if the cradle jerked, if the hull entered the water at the wrong angle, the result could be catastrophic. Thousands of people gathered to watch the launch: workers and their families, local residents, officials from Paris, journalists from across Europe. The French line had publicized the event extensively. The launch of Normandie was news. The ceremony was brief. Speeches were made. The ship was blessed. Madame Lebrun, wife of the French president, broke a bottle of champagne against the bow. Workers knocked away the blocks holding the cradle. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the ship began to move. The movement accelerated. The cradle slid down the greased ways, carrying 70,000 tons of steel toward the water. The noise was tremendous, a roar of grinding wood and metal. The hull entered the water, sinking deep before buoyancy lifted it. Water surged outward in waves that rocked boats moored nearby. And then, suddenly, Normandie was afloat. Tugs moved in immediately, sucking lines to prevent the hull from drifting. Workers on deck and in small boats checked for damage. The hull had survived the launch intact. The first critical test had been passed. The ship was towed to a fitting-out berth, where it would remain for another 2.5 years. The work was only half complete. Everything that made Normandie a ship rather than a hull still had to be installed: engines, boilers, electrical systems, plumbing, interior accommodations, furnishings, equipment. The fitting-out phase required different skills than hull construction. Instead of steelworkers, the yard now needed electricians, pupfitters, carpenters, painters, decorators. These workers arrived in waves, their numbers rising and falling as different phases of work reached completion. This phase was also when artists began to arrive. The murals, the lighting fixtures, the decorative metalwork, the furniture, all had to be installed according to careful plans. Art and engineering had to coexist in the same spaces at the same time. This created friction. Electricians needed to run cables. Artists needed pristine walls for murals. Plumbers needed to install pipes. Designers needed specific dimensions and positions for furniture. Everyone was working to deadlines. Everyone believed their work was most important. The project managers had to mediate these conflicts daily. Compromise was continuous. A pipe run would be rerouted to avoid damaging a decorative panel. A mural would be modified to accommodate a necessary ventilation duct. A light fixture would be repositioned to suit both electrical requirements and aesthetic needs. By 1934, the ship was beginning to look complete. The superstructure was enclosed, funnels were installed, promenade decks were laid with teak planking, windows were glazed, the hull was painted. But appearances were deceptive. Inside, work continued at an intense pace. Systems were being tested, problems were being identified and corrected, final details were being addressed. The ship would not be ready for service until May 1935. The workers who built Normandie left almost no written record. They were not artists or engineers who published their work. They were skilled tradesmen who built something beautiful and then moved on to the next project. Their names are largely forgotten. But their work remains visible in every photograph of the ship. The fair curves of the hull, the precise fit of the plates, the quality of the interior finishes all testify to their skill and dedication. They built this thing, and they built it well. Saint-Nazaire returned to routine work after Normandie sailed away. Other ships would be built on the same ways, by the same workforce, using the same methods. But everyone who had worked on Normandie knew they had been part of something exceptional. They had built the workers' cathedral, and for a few years, it had been the most beautiful ship in the world. We must now enter the ship and understand what passengers experienced when they stepped aboard. The first-class entrance was on the promenade deck, amidships. Passengers arriving by tender from La Havre climbed a broad stairway and entered through tall bronze doors. Immediately inside was the main hall, a space 3 decks high, surrounded by columns faced with Algerian onyx, lit by ceiling fixtures designed by Leluc. This entrance was designed to overwhelm. After the industrial confusion of the dock, passengers stepped into a space that resembled a palace. The message was immediate and clear: you are no longer in the ordinary world. You have entered a realm of luxury and beauty. The main hall served as the ship's social center. Passengers passed through it, moving between their cabins and the public rooms. They met friends here before dinner. They gathered here after entertainment. The space was designed to encourage lingering, with comfortable seating areas and perfect acoustics that allowed conversation without shouting. From the main hall, passengers could move aft to the Grand Salon, a room measuring 46 meters by 13 meters, decorated by Henri Pécun and his collaborators. The ceiling was gold leaf. The walls featured panels by Jean Dunand depicting French colonial possessions. The furniture was custom designed, upholstered in silk and leather. This room was used for afternoon tea, cocktails before dinner, and late evening socializing. A small stage at one end accommodated musicians. The room could seat 300 people comfortably, more if they stood. Large windows on both sides provided ocean views, though passengers in first class seemed more interested in viewing each other. The smoking room was forward, a darker space paneled in mahogany, with leather chairs and low tables. This was explicitly a masculine space in the social conventions of 1935. Women were not forbidden entry, but the room's atmosphere discouraged their presence. Men came here after dinner to drink brandy, smoke cigars, and discuss business or politics away from their wives. The greatest public space was the dining room. It extended from one side of the ship to the other, 93 meters long, 18 meters wide, 8 meters high. The ceiling was illuminated glass panels, creating the impression of daylight even at night. The walls featured gilded bronze panels and allegorical murals. 700 passengers could dine simultaneously. Entering the dining room was a theatrical experience. Passengers descended a broad staircase from the entrance level, making a grand arrival visible to everyone already seated. The restaurant captain would escort each party to their assigned table, which they would occupy for the entire voyage. The tables were set with Havilland china, Crustufla silver, and Baccarat crystal. Fresh flowers were replaced daily. The linen was changed after every meal. The chairs were upholstered in leather and were surprisingly comfortable despite their formal appearance. The menu offered choice and abundance. A typical first-class dinner might include 8 courses: hors d'oeuvres, soup, fish, meat, salad, cheese, dessert, fruit. The wine list featured hundreds of selections. Passengers could also order dishes not on the menu if the kitchen had the ingredients. The kitchen staff numbered over 70. They worked in spaces deep in the hull, where heat from stoves and ovens made conditions almost unbearable. Refrigerated storage held enough food for 5,000 people for a week. Fresh produce, meat, fish, dairy, all had to be loaded before departure and carefully managed to ensure nothing spoiled. The attention to cuisine was not incidental. French gastronomic culture was central to national identity. The dining room was where France competed most directly with Britain and Germany. British ships served excellent food in the English tradition. German ships were efficient and clean, but only French ships offered genuine Hutter cuisine, prepared by classically trained chefs, served with proper ceremony. Beyond the main dining room, first-class passengers could choose the grill room, a smaller, more informal restaurant open for lunch and late supper. This space was paneled in light wood with nautical themes. The menu emphasized grilled meats and seafood. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost American in character. The café, as it was known, represented a concession to changing social patterns. Not all wealthy passengers wanted formal dining 3 times daily. Some preferred casual meals, quicker service, the ability to dine alone with a book or newspaper. The café accommodated these preferences without compromising the grandeur of the main dining room. First-class cabins varied enormously in size and luxury. The most expensive suites occupied significant portions of entire decks. They included bedrooms, bathrooms, sitting rooms, private verandas. They were decorated with genuine antiques, original artworks, hand-woven carpets. Some suites had grand pianos. Even standard first-class cabins were spacious by shipboard standards. They measured approximately 4 meters by 3 meters and included a proper bed, not a bunk, a writing desk, upholstered seating, and a private bathroom with tub. The walls were paneled in wood or covered in fabric. The lighting was adjustable for reading or embodiment. Every cabin had a telephone connecting to the ship's internal system. Passengers could ring for their steward, make dinner reservations, or speak with other passengers. This seems ordinary now. In 1935, it was remarkable. Most homes did not have telephones. The second-class accommodations occupied less space but maintained high standards. Second-class passengers had their own dining room, smoking room, and salon. These spaces were smaller than first-class equivalents, but were still decorated with quality materials and careful design. Second class on Normandie exceeded first class on many other ships. This was strategic. The French line understood that most passengers could not afford first-class fares. To fill the ship, to make the economics work, they needed to attract second-class passengers and make them feel that they too were experiencing luxury. The distinction between classes was real but not absolute. Third-class accommodations were simpler but still clean and comfortable. Cabins contained bunks rather than beds, shared bathrooms served multiple cabins, public spaces were functional rather than decorative. But third-class passengers on Normandie traveled in conditions that many working-class Europeans would have considered quite adequate. The class system aboard the ship reflected the class system in European society. This segregation seems offensive to contemporary sensibilities, but it was completely normal in 1935. First-class passengers paid perhaps 10 times what third-class passengers paid. They expected and received vastly superior accommodations and service. The ship's design enforced this separation. Staircases and passageways serving different classes did not interconnect. First-class passengers could not accidentally wander into third-class spaces and vice versa. This segregation was not merely social convention. It was architectural fact, built into the steel structure of the ship. Yet all passengers, regardless of class, experienced the fundamental reality of the voyage. They were at sea. They shared the same weather, the same waves, the same horizon. A storm in the North Atlantic affected everyone equally. This common experience, beneath the social distinctions, created a temporary community that would dissolve upon arrival in New York. The ship contained spaces passengers never saw. The crew quarters were functional and cramped. Stewards, waiters, cooks, stokers, engineers, sailors all lived aboard in conditions far inferior to even third-class passengers. They worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week during the voyage. Their pay was modest. Their lives were hard. Below the crew quarters were machinery spaces. The engine rooms were vast industrial canyons filled with turbines, generators, condensers, pumps, and piping. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar of steam and machinery. Engineers and stokers worked in heat and noise that would be considered intolerable today. They wore minimal clothing and drank enormous quantities of water to avoid heat exhaustion. Still deeper were cargo holds. Normandie carried mail, which was profitable, and general cargo, which helped offset operating costs. These holds were empty spaces accessible through hatches on the main deck. Cargo was loaded by crane before departure and unloaded upon arrival. Passengers were unaware of its presence. The ship also contained spaces that existed only for emergencies. Lifeboats hung from davits on the boat deck. Fire stations were distributed throughout the hull. Watertight doors could be closed to contain flooding. These safety features were invisible under normal circumstances, but essential to the ship's ability to operate safely. Now consider the artistic program. More than 50 French artists contributed work to Normandie's interiors. This was not simply decoration. It was a comprehensive attempt to display French artistic achievement in every available space. Jean Duppers created large murals showing allegorical scenes of French history and culture. His work was precise, colorful, idealized. The figures were heroic but not realistic. The compositions were balanced and harmonious. This was art designed to inspire confidence and pride, not to challenge or disturb. René Leluc designed lighting fixtures throughout the ship. He worked in glass, creating elaborate chandeliers, wall sconces, and decorative panels. His designs incorporated stylized natural forms, flowers, plants, abstract patterns. The glass was often translucent rather than transparent, diffusing light to create soft, flattering illumination. Jean Dunand specialized in lacquer work, a technique learned from Japanese masters and adapted to French aesthetics. His panels depicted French colonial scenes and exotic subjects. The lacquer created depth and luminosity impossible to achieve with paint. Each panel required months of work, building up layers of lacquer and polishing them to mirror smoothness. Ramond Subs designed metalwork, particularly the elaborate bronze doors, grills, and railings throughout the ship. His work was geometric and precise, with interlocking patterns that created visual complexity while maintaining structural clarity. Metal was treated as an expressive medium, not merely functional material. The furniture was custom designed for each space. Chairs, tables, sofas, desks, cabinets, all were created specifically for Normandie. Craftsmen built these pieces in workshops in Paris, then disassembled them for transport to Saint-Nazaire, where they were reassembled and installed in the ship. Textiles were equally important. Silk, velvet, wool, and linen were woven with patterns designed to complement the overall aesthetic of each room. Carpets were handwoven to exact dimensions, with patterns that guided pedestrian flow and defined different functional areas within large spaces. This total design approach meant that nothing was arbitrary. Every object, every surface, every calque was chosen to contribute to a unified aesthetic experience. Walking through the ship, passengers moved through a carefully orchestrated sequence of spaces, each with its own character, all expressing variants of the same underlying principles. The effect was overwhelming but not chaotic. Modern eyes, accustomed to minimalism, might find Normandie's interiors excessive, but the designers were not seeking minimalism. They were seeking richness, abundance, proof of mastery and craft. Every surface was an opportunity to demonstrate skill. This approach was expensive. The artistic budget for Normandie exceeded the construction budget of some entire ships. The French line justified this expense by arguing that the ship's beauty would generate publicity and attract passengers willing to pay premium fares for a superior experience. They were correct. When Normandie entered service, the public response was extraordinary. Newspapers published photographs of the interiors. Magazines wrote articles describing the luxury. Word spread that this ship was unlike anything else afloat. People booked passage not merely to cross the Atlantic efficiently, but to experience the ship itself. The floating museum had become a destination. This was new. Previous ships were transportation. Normandie was an experience. This distinction mattered commercially and culturally. But there was a tension in this approach. A museum is a place one visits and then leaves. A ship is a machine for crossing an ocean. Normandie had to function as both simultaneously. The art had to coexist with machinery, with safety equipment, with mundane realities like sewage systems and garbage disposal. The designers navigated this tension by creating zones. Public spaces were museum quality. Service spaces were functional. Passengers experienced the former and were shielded from the latter. This required extensive hidden infrastructure, service corridors, staff stairways, storage spaces, all concealed behind decorative panels. The result was a kind of theater. The passengers were audience members watching a performance. The staff were actors playing roles. The ship itself was the stage set. Everyone understood this arrangement implicitly. Everyone participated willingly. When passengers remember Normandie, they remember the interiors more than any other aspect of the ship. They remember the grand salon, the dining room, the main hall. These spaces lodged in memory because they were so unlike anything else these passengers had experienced. This was the purpose: to create memory, to establish France as the arbiter of luxury and beauty, to demonstrate that even in the machine age, craft and art remained essential. The floating Musée des Arts Décoratifs sailed for only 4 years. But in that brief time, it established a standard that no subsequent ship ever equaled. Later ships were larger, faster, more profitable, but none were more beautiful. Beauty of this kind requires commitment that transcends economics. It requires believing that appearance matters as much as function, that how something looks shapes what it means, that a ship can be more than transportation, that it can be art. Normandie departed La Havre on May 29, 1935, bound for New York. The departure was ceremonial. Thousands of spectators lined the waterfront. Small boats filled the harbor, their horns sounding in salute. Passengers crowded the decks, waving to people they could no longer distinguish in the crowd below. The ship's whistle sounded, a deep note that carried across the water and over the town. 4 tugboats pulled the ship away from the pier and turned her bow toward the harbor entrance. Once clear of the harbor, Normandie's engines engaged. The tugs released their lines and fell away. The ship was under her own power, beginning her maiden voyage. Captain Runner Pugnut commanded from the bridge. He was 54 years old, a veteran of 30 years with the French line, experienced but not complacent. He understood the pressure. The company, the government, the nation expected success. Anything less would be unacceptable. The first hours were routine. The ship moved down the English Channel at moderate speed while crew familiarized themselves with equipment and procedures. This was the first time all systems had operated simultaneously under real conditions. Small problems emerged and were addressed. A ventilation fan vibrated excessively. A pump developed a small leak. A door jammed. Nothing serious, but everything requiring attention. By evening, Normandie was in open Atlantic water. The weather was good, seas moderate. Pugnut ordered speed increased to 25 knots. The ship responded smoothly. Engineers monitoring the turbines reported normal operation. The hull moved through the water without excessive vibration. Passengers settled into routines. They unpacked, explored the ship, claimed Fuvcrutter chairs in public rooms. First-time Atlantic travelers were surprised by how little motion they felt. Normandie's size and stabilization systems damped the wave action that made smaller ships uncomfortable. Walking the decks felt almost like walking on land. Dinner that first evening was festive. The dining room was full, passengers dressed formally, the orchestra playing softly. Waiters moved efficiently between tables. The kitchen produced meal after meal without apparent strain. Everything functioned as designed. But in the engine rooms, engineers were monitoring a problem. One of the turbines was running slightly hotter than expected, not dangerously hot, but above the predicted temperature. They increased cooling water flow and watched the readings carefully. Over the next 2 days, as speed increased toward the full 29 knots necessary to break the speed record, the temperature issue persisted. The turbine was operating within acceptable limits, but the engineers were not satisfied. Something was causing excess heat, and they needed to understand what. The problem was eventually traced to bearing alignment. The turbine shaft was not perfectly centered in its bearings. The misalignment was tiny, measured in fractions of a millimeter, but at the speeds and loads involved. It created friction and heat. Correcting the problem required stopping the turbine and making adjustments. This presented Pugnut with a choice. He could maintain full speed and risk damage to the turbine, or he could reduce speed, make the adjustment, and accept a slower crossing. Speed mattered. The blue ribbon depended on beating the existing record held by the Italian liner Rex. Every hour mattered. Pugnut chose caution. He reduced speed temporarily, allowed engineers to make adjustments, then increased speed again. The temperature problem improved, but did not completely resolve. The turbine remained slightly warm throughout the crossing. Despite this issue, Normandie completed the westbound crossing in 4 days, 3 hours, and 14 minutes, averaging 29.98 knots. This was a new record, faster than any ship had crossed the Atlantic. The French line had its blue ribbon. The arrival in New York was spectacular. Hundreds of vessels filled the harbor, accompanying Normandie up the Hudson River to her pier. Fireboats shot streams of water into the air, aircraft circled overhead. An estimated 1 million people lined the waterfront to watch. This reception was extraordinary even by New York standards. The city was accustomed to welcoming new ships, but Normandie generated genuine excitement. New Yorkers had read about the ship's luxury and speed. They wanted to see it for themselves. The ship docked at Pier 88, a facility specially lengthened to accommodate Normandie's 300-meter length. Passengers disembarked through customs, then many returned to tour the ship during its stay in port. The French line organized tours for journalists, officials, and paying visitors. Over 100,000 people visited the ship during its 4-day stay. The American press was enthusiastic. Newspapers printed photographs and descriptions. Magazine writers praised the ship's beauty. Some criticized the interiors as too ornate for American taste, but even these critics acknowledged the achievement. France had built something remarkable. But the maiden voyage had also revealed problems. The turbine heating issue required investigation and correction. Vibration in some passenger areas was worse than expected. Several pieces of custom furniture had been damaged during the crossing. Minor system failures had occurred throughout the ship. These problems were not unusual for a maiden voyage. All new ships experience difficulties during initial operation. Engineers expect to spend the first year identifying and correcting problems, but the publicity surrounding Normandie meant that every problem would be magnified and scrutinized. The eastbound return voyage was faster still. Normandie crossed in 4 days, 3 hours and 2 minutes, averaging 30.31 knots. This established the ship as definitively the fastest on the Atlantic. The turbine temperature remained elevated but stable. Engineers concluded that the problem was manageable, though not ideal. Over the following months, Normandie settled into regular service. Westbound 1 week, 3 days in New York, eastbound the next week, 3 days in Le Havre. This schedule demanded extraordinary efficiency. The ship had to be cleaned, reprovisioned, refueled, and made ready for the next voyage within 72 hours. Crew worked continuously during port calls. Cleaning staff scrubbed and polished. Kitchen staff loaded food and supplies. Engineers performed maintenance and repairs. Stewards prepared cabins for new passengers. The turnaround was industrial process, precisely choreographed to meet the schedule. Passenger demand was strong. First class was usually fully booked. Second class was well filled. Even third class attracted passengers. The ship was profitable from the beginning, which relieved the French line's financial concerns. Building Normandie had been expensive. Operating it needed to generate revenue to justify the investment. The crew numbered approximately 1,300. They came from across France and French colonies. Most were experienced seamen who had worked on other ships, but Normandie's size and complexity required training. Engineers had to learn new systems. Waiters had to master new procedures. Everyone had to adapt to working on the largest, most complex ship afloat. Labor relations were generally good, but not without friction. Crew worked long hours for modest pay. They lived in cramped quarters and had limited time off. Passenger luxury was built on crew labor, a fact that passengers rarely considered. The staff who served meals, cleaned cabins, and maintained the ship were invisible to most passengers. This invisibility was intentional. The ship's design separated passenger and crew spaces. Crew used hidden corridors and stairways. They appeared when needed and disappeared when their work was complete. This preserved the illusion that the ship operated effortlessly, that luxury required no labor. But the labor was real and continuous. Stewards worked every day of the voyage. Cooks worked shifts around the clock. Engineers maintained constant watch on machinery. The ship never rested, so the crew could not rest completely. After 6 months of operation, the French line conducted a detailed assessment. Normandie was successful. The ship attracted passengers, generated positive publicity, and operated reliably. The engineering problems from the maiden voyage had been addressed. The ship was now performing close to design specifications. But competition was emerging. The Cunard line was building a new ship, Queen Mary, that would be larger and potentially faster than Normandie. The Germans were rumored to be planning new ships as well. The the supremacy Normandie had established would be challenged. This competition was healthy from a technical standpoint. It drove innovation and improvement, but it was also exhausting. Every advantage was temporary. Every record would be broken. The only way to maintain leadership was continuous improvement and relentless attention to quality. Normandie's maiden voyage had been a triumph. The ship had proven its speed, demonstrated its beauty, and captured international attention. But triumph is a moment. Success is sustained over time. The ship would need to continue performing, continue attracting passengers, continue justifying its existence. The brief paradise had begun. How long it would last, no one could predict. A transatlantic crossing lasted 5 days. In that time, a temporary society formed among passengers and crew. This society had structure. First-class passengers interacted primarily with other first-class passengers. They dined together, attended the same entertainment, occupied the same public spaces. Friendships formed quickly. Relationships sometimes developed. By the end of the voyage, strangers had become acquaintances and occasionally something more. The social dynamics were complex. Wealth and status that mattered on land still mattered aboard ship, but shipboard life created its own hierarchies. Someone might be important in business or politics, but dull company at dinner. Someone else might be socially obscure, but fascinating to talk with during long afternoons at sea. Gender relations followed the conventions of the era. Men and women dined together, socialized together, but certain spaces remained predominantly masculine or feminine. The smoking room was for men. The writing room was frequented by women. These divisions were not enforced by rule, but by custom, which was more powerful than any regulation. Younger passengers often found the voyage liberating. They were away from family, from familiar social constraints. They could present themselves however they wished. This freedom was temporary, lasting only for the duration of the voyage, but it was real. Shipboard romances were common, usually ending upon arrival. Older passengers often treated the voyage as an extension of their normal lives. They maintained routines, read newspapers, wrote letters. They were crossing the Atlantic because it was necessary, not because the journey itself held appeal. They endured the voyage rather than enjoying it. Families with children faced particular challenges. The ship had limited facilities for children. No playground, no special dining areas, no organized activities. Parents had to entertain their children while also managing their own needs. This was difficult in spaces designed for adult comfort and adult aesthetics. The ship's routine was structured by meals. Breakfast was served from 7 to 10, lunch from 12 to 2, dinner from 7 to 9. These mealtimes organized the day. Passengers arranged their activities around eating. Morning was for exercise on deck or reading in the library. Afternoon was for socializing or rest. Evening was for entertainment. Entertainment varied. The ship had no movie theater, unlike some contemporary vessels. Instead, passengers created their own amusement. Card games were popular. Bridge, poker, and other games occupied hours. Some passengers played for money, sometimes significant amounts. The ship's orchestra performed twice daily during afternoon tea and after dinner. They played light classical music and popular songs. The musicians were skilled professionals, not merely background performers. Passengers attended these performances, requesting favorites, applauding good playing. Lectures were offered several times per voyage. Speakers discussed art, literature, current events, travel destinations. Attendance varied. Some passengers appreciated intellectual stimulation. Others had no interest and never attended. Dancing occurred most evenings in the Grand Salon. The orchestra played dance music and couples moved around the floor. Dancing was social theater, an opportunity to display grace and partnership. Young people danced with enthusiasm. Older people danced more formally. Everyone watched everyone else. Religious services were held on Sundays. A Roman Catholic priest celebrated Mass. A Protestant minister held services. These were optional, but many passengers attended. Religion provided continuity with home, comfort in an unfamiliar environment. The ship's newspaper was published daily, printing news received by radio. This kept passengers informed of world events, stock prices, sports results. Reading the newspaper at breakfast became routine for many passengers. The world continued while they were at sea, and they wanted to remain connected. Letter writing was common. Passengers wrote to family and business associates, letters that would be posted upon arrival. They described the voyage, the ship, their fellow passengers. These letters provide much of what we know about life aboard, personal testimony from people living the experience. Now consider the crew's perspective. For them, this was not a vacation. It was work. The same work, repeated every week for years. Stewards saw passenger enthusiasm and responded professionally, but they themselves had seen it all before. Every voyage was different to passengers. To crew, every voyage was the same. The relationship between passengers and crew was formal and hierarchical. Passengers gave orders, crew obeyed. This was expected and unquestioned, but within this structure, personal relationships sometimes developed. A passenger might develop rapport with a particular steward, requesting him specifically on subsequent voyages. This was professional familiarity, not friendship, but it mattered to both parties. Crew members came from diverse backgrounds. Stewards were often from working-class families trained in hospitality trades. Engineers were technically educated, often from middle-class backgrounds. Officers were from various social classes, united by nautical training and professional competence. These different backgrounds created tensions. Engineers sometimes resented the deference shown to deck officers. Stewards sometimes resented the superior living conditions officers enjoyed. These resentments rarely surfaced openly, but they shaped the social dynamics below decks. Crew had their own social spaces. A crew mess served meals. A crew lounge provided space for relaxation. These areas were functional, not luxurious, but they were necessary. Crew needed space away from passengers, space where they could be themselves without performing service roles. The distinction between front of house and back of house was absolute. Passengers never saw the crew quarters, the crew mess, the working areas where their comfort was produced. This invisibility was essential to the illusion of effortless luxury. Think about the labor required to serve 700 passengers in the dining room. Food had to be prepared, plated, carried to tables, served, then dishes cleared, washed, and stored. This required precise coordination among dozens of people. One delay would cascade into others. The operation had to be perfect every meal, every day of the voyage. Or consider cabin service. Every first-class cabin was cleaned daily, beds made, bathrooms scrubbed, fresh towels provided. Stewards did this work invisibly, entering cabins while passengers were at meals. The passengers returned to find everything perfect, as if it had happened by magic. This magic was labor, continuous, skilled, physically demanding labor. The crew made the ship function. They were essential, but they were also replaceable. The French line employed thousands of seamen. If someone quit or was fired, another would be hired immediately. Job security was minimal. Crew served at the company's pleasure. They could be dismissed for poor performance, for illness, for any reason management deemed sufficient. This precarity shaped behavior. Crew could not afford to complain, to resist, to demand better conditions. Unions were beginning to organize maritime workers in the 1930s, but their power was limited. The companies could break strikes by hiring replacement workers. The threat of dismissal kept most crew compliant. Yet despite these conditions, many crew took pride in their work. They were part of something extraordinary. They worked on the finest ship afloat. They served passengers who were wealthy, famous, powerful. This provided satisfaction that transcended difficult working conditions. National pride also mattered. Normandie was French. The crew represented France to international passengers. This carried responsibility and also dignity. They were not merely workers, they were ambassadors. Now consider the ship itself as a social environment. It was isolated. Once at sea, the ship was days from land. Passengers and crew formed a closed society. Whatever happened aboard stayed aboard. This isolation created intimacy and also tension. Conflicts that might be minor on land became significant at sea. A perceived slight, an unwanted advance, a minor dispute could escalate because there was no escape. Passengers could not leave. They had to coexist with people they might prefer to avoid. The ship's officers mediated these conflicts. The purser handled passenger complaints. The captain had final authority over everything aboard. This authority was nearly absolute. The captain could confine disruptive passengers to their cabins, could order crew disciplined, could make decisions without consultation. Most voyages were peaceful, people behaved appropriately, but occasionally problems occurred. Drunkenness, theft, assault all happened. The ship had a small brig where unruly passengers or crew could be confined. This was rarely used, but its existence reminded everyone that order must be maintained. Weather affected shipboard society. Good weather encouraged outdoor activity. Passengers walked the promenade decks, sat in deck chairs, took sun and air. They were visible to each other, available for conversation. The ship felt spacious and comfortable. Bad weather drove everyone indoors. Public rooms became crowded. The ship's motion made some passengers ill. Social life constricted. People retreated to their cabins. The atmosphere became claustrophobic. A North Atlantic storm could be frightening. Waves 30 feet high, winds strong enough to make walking difficult, the ship rolling and pitching. Passengers who had never experienced such weather were genuinely scared. They gathered in public spaces, seeking company and reassurance. Experienced travelers knew to remain calm. Storms were normal. The ship was built to handle them. Officers maintained confident demeanors, reassuring passengers that everything was under control. Usually they were correct. Occasionally they were not. The social structure aboard Normandie reflected French society of the 1930s. Hierarchical, status-conscious, but also allowing for merit and individual distinction. Money mattered, family background mattered, but intelligence, charm, wit also mattered. Someone could improve their social position through personal qualities. This meritocratic element was limited but real. A young person from modest background, but with education and talent, could access opportunities aboard ship that might be closed on land. Temporary communities allow temporary mobility. 5 days was long enough for superficial relationships, but rarely long enough for deep connection. Passengers met, conversed, enjoyed each other's company, then parted upon arrival. They might never meet again. This transience shaped interactions. People could be charming, entertaining, even intimate, knowing that consequences were minimal. Some passengers crossed the Atlantic frequently. They became regulars, known to the crew, recognized by other frequent travelers. They had favorite cabins, favorite tables in the dining room. They formed a subculture within the larger passenger population. These regulars provided continuity. New passengers, overwhelmed by the ship's luxury, looked to regulars for social cues: how to behave, what to wear, when to tip. Regulars taught informal rules that made the voyage smoother for everyone. The sociology aboard Normandie was microcosm of larger society. Class division, gender roles, national identity, labor relations, all played out in compressed form during each voyage. The ship was not separate from the world. It was the world in miniature, floating on the Atlantic. On May 27, 1936, exactly 1 year after Normandie's maiden voyage, the Cunard Line's Queen Mary entered service. She was larger than Normandie. She was nearly as fast. She was unquestionably British. The rivalry between the two ships would define the late 1930s and demonstrate profound differences between French and British approaches to luxury, engineering, and national identity. Queen Mary measured 310 meters overall, 17 meters longer than Normandie. She was heavier by 5,000 tons. Her passenger capacity was slightly greater. On paper, the British ship had slight advantages. But numbers do not capture aesthetic and cultural differences. The two ships represented different philosophies of design, different concepts of what a great ship should be. Normandie was artistic, Queen Mary was comfortable. This distinction mattered enormously. Normandie's interiors dazzled, overwhelmed, announced themselves as extraordinary. Queen Mary's interiors soothed, reassured, felt like home. Neither approach was superior. They served different purposes and appealed to different sensibilities. British passengers tended to prefer Queen Mary. French passengers tended to prefer Normandie. American passengers, who constituted the majority of Atlantic travelers, divided their loyalty. Some appreciated French flair and elegance. Others preferred British solidity and discretion. The rivalry extended to speed. Normandie held the blue ribbon through 1935. Queen Mary captured it on her first westbound voyage in August 1936, crossing at 30.14 knots. Normandie recaptured the record in July 1937, crossing at 31.2 knots. Queen Mary took it back in August 37 at 31.69 knots. Normandie regained it one final time in August 1938 at 31.27 knots westbound and 30.99 eastbound. These record-breaking runs were expensive. They required maximum power, which meant maximum fuel consumption. The ships burned hundreds of additional tons of oil to achieve fractions of a knot improvement. The cost was justified only by the publicity value. Passengers cared about speed, but mostly symbolically. Arriving a few hours earlier made little practical difference, but traveling on the fastest ship mattered psychologically. It suggested being part of progress, modernity, achievement. The blue ribbon was marketing, not merely technical accomplishment. Press coverage of the rivalry was extensive. Newspapers treated each record-breaking crossing as significant news. They published comparison charts, technical specifications, passenger testimonials. The contest between the ships became proxy for larger Anglo-French competition. This competition had deep historical roots. Britain and France had been rivals for centuries. They had fought numerous wars. They had competed for colonial territories, commercial advantages, cultural prestige. The shipboard rivalry channeled these historical tensions into peaceful, commercial competition. The British approach to ship design emphasized tradition and continuity. Queen Mary's first-class interiors featured wood paneling, traditional furniture, conservative colors. The aesthetic referenced British country houses, gentlemen's clubs, established institutions. Everything suggested permanence and reliability. This was calculated. British passengers, particularly upper-class passengers, valued tradition. They were suspicious of novelty. They wanted to feel aboard ship as they felt in their homes. Queen Mary provided this comfort. The French approach emphasized modernity and innovation. Normandie's interiors celebrated contemporary art, new materials, experimental designs. The aesthetic looked forward, not backward. Everything suggested progress and creativity. This also was calculated. French culture valued artistic innovation. French passengers expected France to lead in aesthetic matters. Normandie fulfilled this expectation. American passengers evaluated both ships pragmatically. They assessed value for money, quality of service, food, entertainment. Most found both ships excellent but noted differences. Normandie was more exciting but also more formal. Queen Mary was more relaxed but also more conservative. Price influenced choice. The two shipping lines competed for passengers partly through fare reductions and special offers. This competition benefited passengers but pressured profits. Both companies struggled financially despite high passenger loads. The global economic situation remained difficult through the late 1930s. The Depression had eased but not ended. International travel was recovering but had not returned to pre-1929 levels. Building and operating expensive ships was risky business. Both Normandie and Queen Mary required government subsidies to remain viable. The French government supported the French line through direct payments and favorable loans. The British government provided similar support to Cunard. Neither ship could have been built or operated without state involvement. This government support was justified as national interest. The ships demonstrated technological capability and cultural achievement. They employed thousands of workers. They promoted national prestige. These benefits supposedly justified the expense. Critics questioned this logic. They argued that subsidizing luxury ships while many citizens struggled economically was inappropriate. Money spent on Normandie and Queen Mary could have funded schools, hospitals, housing. The ships benefited the wealthy few, not the general public. Defenders responded that the ships employed workers, purchased supplies, generated economic activity. Building Normandie kept the Saint-Nazaire shipyard operating through the Depression. The benefits cascaded through the economy beyond direct expenditures. Both arguments had merit. The ships were simultaneously economic stimulus and extravagant waste. They provided employment and demonstrated state capacity while also representing questionable priorities. This ambiguity characterized many Depression-era public works projects. The rivalry between the ships was commercial but also emotional. Crew members took pride in their vessel. French crew believed Normandie was superior. British crew believed Queen Mary was superior. These beliefs were sincere and deeply felt. Passengers participated in this rivalry. They defended their choice of ship in conversations and correspondence. They compared experiences and argued about which vessel provided better service, better food, better comfort. These debates were usually friendly but occasionally heated. The two ships did not often meet at sea. The Atlantic is vast, and both ships followed great circle routes that did not necessarily coincide, but occasionally they passed within sight of each other. When this happened, passengers and crew of both ships would gather on deck to watch. Cameras captured these encounters. The photographs became iconic. These passing encounters had ceremonial quality. Whistles would sound in salute. Passengers would wave. For a few minutes, the ships acknowledged each other, then continued their separate courses. These moments emphasized the rivalry, but also the mutual respect. Both ships faced the same challenges: North Atlantic weather, mechanical problems, crew management, passenger expectations. Both ships succeeded and failed in similar ways. The rivalry obscured these commonalities but did not eliminate them. Technical experts recognized that both ships represented the peak of 1930s ocean liner design. Later ships would be larger, but none would exceed the quality of engineering and craft embodied in Normandie and Queen Mary. They were culmination, not beginning. By 1938, it was clear that both ships were vulnerable. The international situation was deteriorating. War seemed increasingly likely. If war came, civilian passenger service would end. The ships would be requisitioned for military use or laid up. The rivalry would become irrelevant. Passengers in 38 and 39 sensed this vulnerability. Conversations aboard both ships included speculation about war, about what would happen to the ships, about whether this voyage might be the last peaceful crossing. There was melancholy beneath the luxury, awareness that this world might soon end. The rivalry between Normandie and Queen Mary was ultimately a rivalry between two visions of what European civilization could be. The French vision emphasized art, beauty, innovation, and the belief that culture should lead society forward. The British vision emphasized stability, tradition, continuity, and the belief that proven values should anchor society against change. Neither vision was wrong. Both had produced magnificent ships that served passengers well and demonstrated national capability, but both visions were products of a particular historical moment that was ending. The modern ocean liner reached its peak in the late 1930s. Normandie and Queen Mary represented the finest expression of this form. They were as perfect as ships could be given the technology, materials, and social structures of their era. Nothing built later surpassed them in their specific qualities. But perfection is not permanence. Both ships were products of an unstable peace between two catastrophic wars. They existed in an interlude, a brief period when it seemed possible that international cooperation, technological progress, and cultural achievement might create lasting prosperity. That hope was misplaced. The world was moving toward another war, more destructive than the first. The ships that had symbolized peace and progress would become casualties of conflict. The rivalry would end not with one ship decisively surpassing the other, but with both ships withdrawn from service. The Anglo-French dialectic embodied in these ships was really a debate about modernity. How should societies respond to technological change? Should they embrace innovation and artistic experimentation, as France advocated? Or should they maintain traditional forms and values while selectively adopting new technologies, as Britain advocated? The question was never answered definitively. Both approaches had strengths and weaknesses. Both produced beautiful, functional ships. Both satisfied passengers and employed workers. The rivalry demonstrated that multiple paths to excellence existed. What the rivalry also demonstrated was that commercial competition could channel national rivalries into productive directions. France and Britain competed through ships rather than armies. They sought superiority in engineering and design rather than conquest. This was progress of a kind. But this peaceful competition depended on international stability. When that stability collapsed, when war came, the ships could not preserve peace. They were symptoms of a peaceful era, not causes of it. When the era ended, the ships became obsolete. Looking at photographs of Normandie and Queen Mary together, one is struck by their similarity as much as their differences. Both were very large, very fast, very luxurious. Both had 3 funnels, raked superstructures, streamlined hulls. Both looked modern in the specific aesthetic of the 1930s. The differences were real but subtle. Normandie's lines were slightly more elegant. Queen Mary's profile was slightly more powerful. These distinctions mattered to enthusiasts and engineers. To ordinary observers, both ships were magnificent and impressive. The rivalry between them was manufactured to some degree. The shipping companies and governments encouraged comparison and competition because it generated publicity. Passengers participated because it gave them something to discuss and debate. The ships themselves were simply doing what they were designed to do, carrying people across the oceans safely and comfortably. In retrospect, the rivalry seems almost quaint. 2 nations competing to build the most beautiful ship while the world prepared for war. The disproportion between means and ends, between effort and purpose, seems almost absurd. Yet the people involved took it seriously. It mattered to them. Perhaps it mattered because it was one of the few international competitions that remained peaceful. In a world increasingly dominated by militarism and authoritarianism, the shipboard rivalry represented older values: commercial competition, technological innovation, cultural expression. These were values worth preserving. The final phase of the rivalry came in 1939. Both ships operated normally through the summer. Bookings remained strong. Passengers still wanted to cross the Atlantic in luxury. The ships provided that service without interruption. But everyone knew that change was coming. Hitler had occupied Czechoslovakia. Germany was demanding territorial concessions from Poland. Britain and France had guaranteed Poland's independence. The diplomatic situation was approaching crisis. In this context, each voyage had provisional quality. Passengers and crew went through familiar routines while wondering if this might be the last time. The ships that had seemed permanent suddenly seemed fragile, dependent on political circumstances beyond their control. The Anglo-French dialectic was about to be tested not through commercial competition, but through military alliance. Britain and France would need to cooperate against Germany. Their rivalry would be subordinated to shared necessity. The ships that had symbolized competition would become symbols of alliance. But that alliance would come too late to save Normandie. The ship's fate was already approaching, though no one aboard could know it. The brief paradise was ending. The rivalry was ending. The world that had created these ships was ending. What remained was memory of what had been possible. 2 nations had built 2 magnificent ships. They had competed peacefully. They had demonstrated excellence. They had created beauty. These achievements could not prevent war, but they testified that human beings were capable of more than destruction. The rivalry between Normandie and Queen Mary stands as one of the last examples of the old European order at its best. Competitive but civilized, nationalistic but respectful, ambitious but constrained by shared values. That order would not survive the war, but for a few years, it produced something worth remembering. We must now consider what happened inside the machinery spaces while passengers ate, danced, and slept above.